Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai, nau mai. Minister, Excellencies, Members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Maty Nikkhou-O'Brien, the founder and executive director of Diplosphere, and I'm most delighted to welcome you this evening. First of all, I would like to thank Honourable Simon Bridges for hosting us at Parliament this evening to discuss such an important topic. New Zealand, Australia, and China, a false choice? The title has a question mark in it. I ask this question because some commentators, home and abroad, are saying that New Zealand must choose sides or is choosing the wrong side. And I wanted to rewind a little bit to the very notion of having to choose sides. Do we have to? And if so, why? What has changed? I think much can be gained if we double click on this point. We're most lucky to have a panel to help us drill into the detail. This includes fresh voices that have not been heard in public in New Zealand. And it is most appropriate that this place, our New Zealand Parliament, is where this important question is to be discussed in front of our media, politicians, diplomats, and indeed the public. So we are here to be better informed. And this is the purpose of Diplosphere, a think tank based here in Wellington, which aims to bring fresh views and perspectives on international relations, often missing in the public discourse. We believe that people do want to know more, and we want to encourage independent thinking in New Zealand. We are very fortunate to have here an exceptional lineup of speakers this evening. I'm pleased to welcome Her Excellency Honourable Patricia Forsythe, who's the Australian High Commissioner to New Zealand. All the way from Washington, DC, and it must be around 1:45 a.m., Dr. Michael D. Swaine, who's the Director of the East Asia Program at the Quincy Institute. Hello, Michael. From
Hi.
Canberra, Allan Gyngell, National President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Lucy Craymer, National Correspondent at Staff, and finally, Terence O'Brien, former New Zealand Ambassador and founder and Senior Fellow at the Centre for Strategic Studies at Victoria University. We had also invited representatives from the Chinese and US diplomatic missions to speak, but unfortunately, they were not able to join us. The format of this evening is each of our distinguished speakers will speak for 8 minutes. We will then open the floor for about 20 minutes to take questions. Before we start, please put your mobile phone in silent mode, but feel free to tweet about the event at #Diplosphere. In case of an earthquake, please drop cover and hold. In case of fire, please evacuate the building by the nearest exit behind you. Also, please be ready to listen to the other side and agree to disagree. And now, without any further ado, I'm delighted to pass the floor to our host at Parliament, our Honourable Simon Bridges, for a few remarks. Please help me welcome him.
Koutou, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my real privilege to host you here at Parliament this evening. I'm not going to give much of a speech at all. I just want to make a couple of acknowledgements. Firstly, I want to acknowledge Maty Nikkhou-O'Brien, who with Diplosphere, I think is doing something truly special and something that New Zealand civil society actually needs to see more of. And that's informed, robust discussion on issues of our time, issues that really matter. Recently, I had the pleasure, I think it was a pleasure, Maty, of being in one of the discussions on, I suppose you'd say, cancel culture. And tonight, of course, we discuss China, one of actually, in my view, the issue of our time. I also want to acknowledge both our very distinguished panelists, and they are truly distinguished, and our wider guests, that is you who are here this evening. Given both, I've got no doubt whatsoever that tonight's going to be a night of many views, often divergent views, but all I think that will be, which will be very well thought out and which promises to make for a fascinating night. So I'd like to welcome you to Parliament, and I'd like to, I think, Maty, hand back over to you.
I'm most delighted to pass the floor to Honourable Patricia Forsythe, who is a High Commissioner of Australia to New Zealand. Please join me welcome her.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa. Simon, other members of Parliament, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you for your interest in this topic. Being in Wellington, I think, is a far more civilised time to be having this discussion than for you, Michael, in Washington. I want to start the discussion tonight by outlining the relationship between Australia and China. So let me say at the outset that Australia welcomes the tremendous economic progress that China has made. Its strong productivity growth has resulted in unprecedented economic performance and lifted millions out of poverty. Its success has been a factor in the enduring strength of the Australian economy, just as Australia has played an important role in China's economic success. Australians of Chinese heritage represent well over 1 million people, many from families who have been in Australia for generations, others that have become an integral part of our society quite recently, but they all play a part in our successful multicultural society. But Australia's relationship with China has become increasingly complex. We've always had our differences, but previously we could manage those through frank discussions. Australia and China both benefit from open and rules-based trade and from the strong complementarities between our two economies. China's outlook and external engagement has changed significantly in recent years. China has more openly challenged agreed international rules and norms in a way that concerns other states, including Australia and New Zealand. In this context, Australia is experiencing a range of difficulties in our bilateral relationship, of which you would be well aware. Over the past year, China has taken actions against Australian exports, including coal, barley, wine, meat, rock lobsters, logs, cotton, international education. We are seeking to resolve these issues both bilaterally and through the WTO. For example, Australia has initiated WTO dispute settlement proceedings to address China's imposition of duties on Australia's barley. And this weekend, we commenced proceedings in relation to Australian wine. We expect China to conduct its trade relationship with Australia and all countries in a manner consistent with its commitment to open trade and the multilateral trading system. China expects us to compromise on key national interest in exchange for dialogue and cooperation. Many of the issues about which China has raised concerns relate to important national interest decisions and legislation introduced by Australia in response to evolving security dynamics, even though that legislation is not country specific. Australia has consistently reached out to impose high-level dialogue without preconditions. China is refusing to engage. China's decision last month to suspend cooperation under the Strategic Economic Dialogue, for example, is deeply disappointing to Australia. From our perspective, difficult times call for more dialogue, not less. As we've consistently said, we stand ready to meet and discuss our differences and shared interests without preconditions. The Australian government wants a mature relationship with China where the interests of both sides are respected, and we are proceeding with clear national interest objectives in mind. We do not seek to contain China or to undermine its interests. Both sides benefit enormously from our bilateral partnership and economic ties. The Australian government is approaching its relationship with China in a patient, principled, and coordinated way. We will continue to pursue cooperation where it is in our interests, and we will remain open to constructive dialogue. But there is unlikely to be a quick fix to the current tensions. We expect a prolonged period of uncertainty and pressure, but we will not compromise on our national security and sovereignty, and we will continue to act to protect this. As Prime Minister Morrison said when visiting New Zealand last month, like New Zealand, Australia will never trade away our sovereignty or values. As sovereign countries, Australia and New Zealand each pursue foreign and trade policy goals in ways which reflect each respective interests. But as reinforced by our Prime Ministers recently, Australia and New Zealand are like-minded in our support for a global rules-based system, the promotion of a secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific, and are strong proponents of liberalised trade. And we will both continue to take strong and principled positions on issues such as human rights, demonstrated by our foreign ministers' joint statements on electoral changes in Hong Kong and the grave concerns we expressed on human rights abuses in Xinjiang. In support of this, we will continue to work closely with New Zealand and other partners to realise an open, inclusive and resilient region characterised by an effective health response to the pandemic and a sustainable pathway to recovery, a stable and durable strategic balance where sovereign states can pursue their interests free from coercion, respect for the international agreed rules and norms which underpin our security and prosperity, including peaceful resolution of disputes based on international law, freedom of navigation and overflight, trade and investment based on market principles, inclusive economic integration, and openness to engagement. As I said at the beginning, our relationship with China is complex. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion. Tēnā koutou.
Thank you very much, Her Excellency. I just wanted to mention that Her Excellency was also previously the Executive Director of the Sydney Business Chamber and also served as a member of the New South Wales Legislative Council. Thanks again. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael D. Swaine, who's the Director of East Asia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Michael is a scholar with 30 years of Asia experience and was previously at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and RAND Corporation. So welcome, Michael.
Great, thank you very much, Maty. It's really a pleasure to be here today to address you on these complex issues that we're all facing now in dealing with China. As Maty said, I've been examining the China issue for a long time, and primarily from a security perspective, initially at the RAND Corporation in California and then at the Carnegie Endowment. Now I'm at the Quincy Institute. And I will address the security issues in two ways. First, by looking at what the larger underlying drivers are that are accelerating the onset of what we see going on today, which is sort of great power rivalry in the US-China relationship, and address what are some of the continuities and some of the changes between the Trump and the Biden administrations in dealing with China. And if we have time, I'd also like to discuss some possible initiatives that I think the Chinese should undertake in the relationship that I think could improve relations. So first off, the factors driving China-US strategic tensions, they're pretty clear, actually. What is not so clear is the relative importance of these factors and what needs to be done to reduce their effect while preserving each nation's core values and interests. So several interrelated factors contribute to a negative vicious circle that did not go away with the end of the Trump administration. And this circle is driven by what I call the 3 Ps: power, political systems or ideologies, and policies or politics. At the very root, the combination of several factors operates in these areas. First is a power transition that many people refer to that is occurring both regionally and globally, involving certain assumptions, pro and con, about what's called, from a political science point of view, hegemonic stability, or the ability of a single power to serve to sustain stability within a region or the world. But I'll say more on this in a minute. Secondly, a sense of an ideological or system rivalry that increasingly infuses the relationship, prompting emotional, zero-sum, and often worst-case responses to issues on both sides. And then third, a specific foreign and domestic policy set that each side adopts in part to address specific, often domestic political and economic needs. And then finally, a growing disconnect in the minds of elites and publics on both sides between what each country says it wants and what it actually is doing, which thus reinforces distrust on both sides. Now, to be more concrete, in the matter, for example, the case of China, what is seen by many Americans as a contrast between what Beijing says in some areas, such as win-win, non-hegemonic, non-interference, no cyber hacking, supportive of the global order and of the United Nations, etc. All of these very fine-sounding statements come alongside such other statements, such as the singular importance of the China dream and China's major role in the world, with some uncertainties about what that should be. References to being at the center of the world stage, the Made in China 2025 program, in which China seeks to be a leader, if not the leader, in many key areas of technology. Notions of victory of socialism in the world today, sort of old, long-standing Marxist views about the role of China as a socialist nation, along with Chinese influence operations, a steady buildup of their blue water military, economic, and technological capabilities, Chinese influence ops, of which you're very aware here in New Zealand and Australia, and extensive cyber attacks and thefts, which are taking place in many countries. So you have that kind of contrast. Within the US, you have something similar. And the US, of course, emphasizes its benign nature, its generosity, its emphasis on values, its economic support for countries, and its positive leading role in the world, which is seen by Beijing as a lot of hypocrisy, American interference in domestic affairs, a zero-sum and ideological approach to global politics, a blaming of China for America's own ills, and the engagement in hypocrisy in so many different areas. So to address the insecurities and the uncertainties that these factors produce, each side is taking primarily deterrence, not reassurance policy initiatives that work to deepen the insecurities further, thus driving what is in effect a vicious circle, which is reflected in, for example, references to the inherent superiority of either democracy or socialism over the other, assertions of the US need to maintain military primacy globally, and especially in Asia, or for China to be at the center of the world stage for itself, increasingly zero-sum assessments of technology and economic activities, the idea of decoupling, which leads to zero-sum perspectives and fragmentation of these spheres to everybody's detriment, resistance to engaging in meaningful confidence-building measures and arms control dialogues on particularly contentious issues such as Taiwan, South China Sea, and then, of course, efforts to court third parties in Europe and Asia, especially to gain relative leverage with these parties in the US dealing with one another. Now, there's an obvious need to redress this kind of imbalance without each side conveying weakness in the process. So the question is the Biden administration offering a new opportunity to make such a shift, and is China making use of this opportunity? Now, I have no inside information on this, but there appears to be grounds for both optimism and pessimism on this prospect. And I'll try to be very brief. On the optimistic side, under Biden, the rhetoric at least has been less inflammatory, more cognizant of the need for serious cooperation on a range of critical issues, from climate change and pandemics to some trade and technology. And also there's been an end to the counterproductive Pompeo-style ideological attacks on the CCP and the hinting of a desire for regime change in China. And there's more support for other positive sub-initiatives that could be taken with other countries in Asia and elsewhere, including China, such as with regard to trade and economic issues, and a stress on cooperating as much as possible on things like the pandemic, etc. Biden has said he wants science and reality to rule in addressing the virus and not politics. Now, this should mean that he will support non-political scientific interactions with China on this critical issue. And then finally, in the overall US stress, there is an emphasis on remaining on competition over cooperation, albeit likely defined in ways that are less zero-sum and not oriented toward the concept of China as an existential threat per se. Now, on the Chinese side, Beijing seems to have moved from a more cautious wait-and-see attitude toward the Trump administration shift against China to a general belief that while Biden might be less rhetorical and reckless, the basic orientation of US foreign policy has not really changed. Still a strong yet declining US taking increasingly serious actions that serve to challenge and contain China's growth. Overall, profound changes unseen in a century, as the Chinese put it. And I should say again, the idea is that the United States is strong, still highly influential and highly interactive, but relatively speaking is in decline. And as it declines, it could become, from a Chinese perspective, more, not less dangerous, as it seeks to push back against China in a variety of ways. Now, despite this mixed news, Beijing, perhaps because of it, Beijing sees a long-term struggle with the US ahead. It can no longer base its plans on the assumption of generally stable relations with the US. So it's seeking to counter US leverage and pressure, lessen its dependence on the US, building more domestic autonomy, strengthening ties with other major players where possible, both in Asia and Europe and elsewhere, maintaining a non-hostile external environment, reducing Chinese dependence on the US, and expanding the reach of Chinese influence operations, all to the idea of continuing its emphasis on growth and avoiding conflict. The Chinese still believe they're in an era of peace and development overall, although the challenges to this are increasing from their perspective. Now, from as far as the US is concerned, and I'll be very brief here because I'm really out of time, on the pessimistic side, I think the US, it is working in some ways to try to improve relations with China, but it's definitely working from the outside in, if you will. It's working from relations with other countries around the world toward China, rather than working with China in ways that can rebound outside of the two countries. And by this, I mean they're trying to emphasize influencing allies to come on board with their general take on China, to try to support them, but have them support the US as well, to identify the areas where China is challenging all countries, but particularly democratic countries, to ally with those democratic countries in things like the Quad and in Europe as well. And in general, in this whole process politically, the Biden team is trying to build a bipartisan level of support domestically in the United States and using China in that way, because it needs to have bipartisan support for its domestic policy goals. And China is a very big bipartisan issue in the United States that the Biden administration thinks it needs to be very tough on in order to maintain Republican support. So the Biden administration is more pragmatic. It's trying to be more balanced. It's working more through others, but at the same time, it hasn't really changed the basic analysis of what China is and where it's going. And it has said very little about how to forge a positive relationship with Beijing that can avoid trade and tech decoupling, sustain critical joint work on technology issues, strengthen Asian and global economic growth, and lessen growing tensions over places like Taiwan and other things. So it's still, to some extent, I think, is feeding a rather large and singular great power competition with that kind of mindset. And the Chinese are increasingly doing much of the same. Now, since I've gone on over the 8 minutes I was allotted by a couple of minutes, I better stop there. And in the Q&A, I can offer some more thoughts about where I think the relationship is going and what I think the Chinese, for their part, really need to do here on out. But I think I'll stop there at this point and allow for a question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Our next speaker is Allan Gyngell. Allan is the National President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Prior to that, Allan's illustrious career includes being Director General of the Australian Office of National Assessments, founding Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, and Senior Advisor to Prime Minister Paul Keating. Welcome, Allan.
Well, many thanks, Maty, and thanks to you, Simon, and Diplosphere for the invitation. It's a great honour to be here over Zoom, but I really can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to getting back to New Zealand in person before too long. It's an honour too to be on this panel with High Commissioner Forsythe. She's given us an authoritative account of Australian policy towards China, which I can't match. So I'm going to try and look at the issue through a more historical lens and then offer a couple of reflections on the future. If you had given a 20th century Australian policymaker a blank sheet of paper and asked them to design a world that would perfectly suit their country's interests, they would have come up with something very much like the international landscape that we saw between the time of China's economic reforms in the late 1980s and the aftermath of the global financial crisis around 2010. That was a world in which Australia had an alliance with the most powerful country on earth, the United States, and a deeply complementary economic relationship with a huge and rapidly growing China. This post-Cold War world suited Washington, Beijing, and Canberra equally well, as Australian political leaders from both sides of politics regularly intoned, Australia did not have to choose between America and China, between our security and our prosperity. But from around 2010 onwards, the global environment began to change. In essence, from Australia's perspective, both China and the United States switched from being status quo powers to being non-status quo powers. After the geopolitical disaster of the Iraq invasion and the unexpected economic collapse of the financial crisis, Americans decided that they were no longer getting the returns they wanted from the international system they had created after the Second World War and to which they had contributed so much. The most obvious example of this discontent, of course, was the 2016 election of Donald Trump. But although Trump has gone, temporarily at least, the desire for change remains. In many ways, President Biden's foreign policy for the middle class is, more or less Trump's America first with better manners. And the one thing that unifies a deeply divided American polity at present is the belief that, in President Biden's words, China is eating our lunch. On its side, China changed too. It became, in 2010, the world's second largest economy by exchange rate terms. And 2 years later, Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the Communist Party. He turned out to be the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao, removing the term limits, which had established an expectation of regular top-level political change. China wanted a place in the international system more commensurate with its weight and a system which carried fewer of the overtones and normative values of liberalism. So from the South China Sea to the Belt and Road Initiative, We saw actions that revealed a new international assertiveness. It became more demanding of others, blunter in its responses to critics, and more inclined to deploy economic coercion. So one result of all this was that Australia became an early recipient of Chinese displeasure. Particular policy positions the government took on issues such as 5G, foreign interference, South China Sea, generated Chinese action against Australian exports, as the High Commissioner mentioned, including coal, barley and wine, although China's continuing reliance on iron ore has kept trade figures high. Now, the Canberra interpretation of this has been that Chinese reactions were completely unwarranted and that Australia has done no more than adhere to its own values. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. The criticisms I would make are not of the policy positions Australia has taken on human rights or the WHO, but on some of the diplomacy in which they've been wrapped. For example, perfectly reasonable Australian legislation against foreign interference from all sources was given a very explicit China focus when the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull defended them by channeling a famous quotation from Mao and declaring in Mandarin that Australia has stood up. The decision taken to ban Chinese participation in the 5G network in Australia was defensible. Is it likely China would allow a Western supplier into its system? But Australia then became the self-declared missionary for persuading other countries to the same cause. There are other examples. As a veteran of years in the Australian intelligence community, I'm in no doubt of the importance of the Five Eyes relationship to our intelligence services, but I think its extension into some other policy areas is both ineffective and dangerous. The veteran Australian journalist Max Such documented recently that Australia has pretty deliberately, I think, positioned itself out in front of America's other allies on China. Now, none of this is to excuse China. Its crude use of economic levers, its wolf warrior diplomacy, and its petulant refusal to take up phone calls from the Australian side show that diplomacy has been missing in action there too. Whatever the cause, the result is that the bilateral relationship is worse than at any point since relations were established in 1972. And it's not clear how we extricate ourselves from this position, or indeed whether either government wants to. The clearest signal of that on the Australian side, I think, was in Prime Minister Morrison's speech on his way to the recent G7 meeting. In that speech in Perth, he drew on language originally used by Condoleezza Rice and called for a world and regional balance of power that favours freedom. Now, it's hard to interpret a world order that favours freedom as anything other than a call for a world order that weighs against China. And that's a real change in the declaratory position of the Australian government. So despite denials from both sides, we do seem to be drawing steadily closer to a decoupled bipolar world like that of the Cold War. Let me just end with three worries about the future. First, I worry about our collective lack of confidence. This is new, and I suspect it comes off the back of American unease. If we believe what we say about the value of democracy, and I certainly do, then we surely believe that our system will deliver better outcomes over the long term and will be resilient enough to stand up to whatever challenges other systems throw at us. Secondly, I worry about the way values, which are certainly important to us, are being interpreted through a particular narrow lens of political systems. Our interests, including our economic interests, also have value. They enable us to fund the sort of prosperous, fair society we want to be. So I worry that people speaking up for the importance of a mutually advantageous trading relationship with the world's largest economy are being accused of disloyalty to some higher national value. I think both of them come under the rubric of values. Finally, I worry about the cohesion of our multicultural society in an environment where, however much the government, and it has tried to do this, insists that the focus is on the Chinese government or the Communist Party of China, but it's China itself which becomes identified as an enemy. And you can see in Lowy Institute polling in our country that nearly 20% of Chinese Australians reported feeling threatened or attacked in the past year because of their ethnicity. So this is going to require the most careful handling. Terence O'Brien and I are almost certainly the only people in this room who were actually working on foreign policy during the Cold War. I certainly remember the anxiety and sense of danger in those years. I keep feeling the need to remind younger colleagues that great power conflict is no small thing. All of us, big powers, middle powers, small powers, have a responsibility to take its management seriously. Thanks, Maty.
Thank you very much, Allan. And we do need wisdom, don't we? Our next speaker is coming freshly from Hong Kong. She's a national correspondent at staff. Lucy also worked for Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong and also in New Zealand. Please welcome her.
Well, I definitely don't have any experience with the Cold War, so I'm not going to give you any talk on that. Because I've sort of come from Hong Kong, I'm going to try and talk about it from the perspective that I have kind of lived through in Hong Kong. I've been home about 3 months, so I left Hong Kong at the end of February to take up a new job covering geopolitics here. And I suppose in the last few months that I was in Hong Kong, I started thinking a lot about values-based foreign policy and New Zealand's response. And it came after, you know, being on the front lines in Hong Kong and talking to protesters who were in, you know, going out week in, week out, putting themselves on the line because they believed in democracy. And I realized in Hong Kong that I believe in very few things, but I very strongly believe in democracy. And being in Hong Kong as a New Zealander and watching the response from my government was something that I struggled with. I worked in an office that was very multinational. I had a lot of friends who came from around the globe. And New Zealand's response was always softer. And I felt it. I'd grown up in a world where as we stood up to the Americans when they wanted to bring nuclear weapons on ships into New Zealand. We stood up to the French when they bombed the Rainbow Warrior. We protested against nuclear testing in the South Pacific. I'd grown up with this idea that New Zealand stood up for what was right, whatever the consequences. And I think that being in Hong Kong and on the front lines, I had no doubt that autonomy, self-determination was something that if I had been born in Hong Kong, in a colony of Britain, I would have wanted. And so watching New Zealand maybe not take as strong a stance as the Australian government or the American government was something that was quite difficult. At the same time, I was covering agriculture and trade for the Wall Street Journal. And so I've spent a lot of time talking about soybeans and pork. So if anyone wants to chat soybeans and pork, it's one of my favorite topics, and much better here because I can say the word pig and everyone knows what I'm talking about. Anyway, so in 2016, I was in a soybean conference, yes, there are such things, in China, dealing with pig feed. And at that point, Trump had just been elected. And, you know, Trump had come out with these very strong kind of policies against China, and people were worried. They were worried about bringing in, whether they needed to front load bringing in soybeans. Now, China's consumption of soybeans is absolutely huge. So bringing them in and hoping for the best was not really possible. And I came back from that conference kind of concerned about soybean trade and agricultural trade. And it was really interesting because in the office, people said to me, you know, they're not going to hit soybeans. China needs soybeans. China needs soybeans to feed its pigs, and it needs pork to feed its population. And I sort of thought, okay, you know, maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe what I'm hearing isn't right. And 18 months on, China put a 25% tariff on soybeans. The reason I tell this is that I'm sort of talking to people out there and I'm worrying that we don't see what China could do to us. That we are going to have to make this choice between taking a stronger line on values-based foreign policy and it may be hitting agriculture. Now, the interesting thing about this was that the soybean market, it hit American farmers. Soybeans dropped by 20%, soybean exports from the US dropped by 20%. So while they found other markets to move some of those soybeans into, they didn't completely replace where they were sending soybeans. And the prices dropped to a decade low. And in China, pork prices, there were sort of several reasons, but pork prices doubled. So Chinese consumers were suffering and American farmers were suffering. But at the end of the day, China was upset with America and they were prepared to take the consequences. But one of the things that also surprised me, that was, you know, 2019, 2020, and I was talking to those farmers, and not just soybean farmers, people who owned almond plantations in the US, and they were still saying, we're doing the right thing. You know, they traditionally were Trump supporters, but they felt like it was a hit that they had to take. You know, they were taking one for the team because they felt that, you know, IP theft in China was a value that they needed to stand up and say that no more. They felt that currency manipulation and what it was doing to trade in the US was something that they needed to stand up and say, we can't keep taking this. And if you bring that back to New Zealand, and the questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves now is, are we prepared to take those kind of consequences? And in New Zealand, where China exports buys so much of our goods, it's not just going to be a hit to the farmers, it's going to be a hit to all of us. And so it kind of circles back to me standing in Hong Kong and really wishing that New Zealand had signed on to a Five Eyes agreement, condemning people that I knew being sent to prison or having to go into exile. There was no New Zealand there. I wanted values-based foreign policy, but is there the support there? And unfortunately, I think it's a question we're all going to have to ask in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Now, finally, I'm pleased to pass the floor to our last speaker, Mr. Terence O'Brien, who's a former New Zealand ambassador, including to the United Nations, WTO-GATT, and senior fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies at Victoria.
As the last speaker, I'm taking the privilege of delivering it from a sitting down position. Given my age, I think that's a very nice gesture on the part of the organizers. Well, the nature of New Zealand's relationship with Beijing has moved well beyond its path-breaking years, and coming to terms with China's growing momentum represents an acute ongoing challenge. Foreign Minister Mahuta advocates, in her own words, a respectful, consistent and predictable New Zealand engagement while avoiding the use of the loud hailer. Her comments are scrutinized meticulously by the media and indeed beyond. Her starting point is the Waitangi Treaty as the touchstone for an independent New Zealand foreign policy. In other words, she reaffirms the simple proposition that all foreign policy begins at home. China is an intensely realist power, and sentimentality plays no part in its international relations. Beijing believes it is entitled to respect from other governments for its undeniable accomplishments and importance in the world of today and tomorrow. Many countries, New Zealand included, vitally depend on China for prosperity. But Beijing's forceful actions with respect to the Uyghur people and towards Hong Kong serve to deny it the respect in that respect in important sections of the global community. The precept that all foreign policy begins at home applies directly to China. The same holds true for the United States. President Biden seeks to embellish American leadership based around its ideals and values. But the evidence of systematic racial injustice, toxic politics, and diluted gun laws presently demean America's claims to being an exceptional nation. US presidents from Eisenhower onwards have asserted that America is great because America is good. But there is a legacy which tarnishes that claim. But President Biden expresses confidence nonetheless that the US can be a leader of a values-driven international community of democracies. The notion that outside pressure to spread democracy which serves to ensure a peaceable world should be treated judiciously. Democracy takes different forms. New Zealand's version, built upon reconciliation through the Treaty of Waitangi, is not quite the same as those gathered very recently at Cornwall in England. A more hybrid world order, where different countries choose to keep different company on different issues, is perhaps the more likely outcome of an unmoderated China-United States competition. An assortment of choices rather than one single all-embracing decision about where definitively to line up may become the reality and incidentally pose ever greater burdens for small country diplomacy. America's strategic response to China must, however, obviously influence others. The view that China poses an existential threat to the United States is shared among the Washington security community. President Biden's senior advisor on Asian affairs, Kurt Campbell, asserted recently that the period of US engagement with China is now over. On transcendental issues like climate change, COVID, and nuclear proliferation, Campbell envisaged the two governments could or would interact in international institutions. But devising of robust rules for the modern era in trade, space, science, advanced technology, artificial intelligence, cyber, and beyond, US engagement would not, Campbell inferred, include China. Policies inherited from the Trump era to decouple the two economies and to fragment supply chains to thwart China are to be maintained. And behind the Campbell thesis, there are serious questions, serious choices for the future relevance of established institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization, and so forth. At the most recent G7 and NATO summits, President Biden sought to rally support for his China policy. It's not clear yet how far he succeeded. The language of the two profuse communiques almost certainly disguises differing shades of opinion. Certain key participants are unlikely, for example, to share the American view that China poses a threat to their very existence. The G7 communique contains no mention of Asia as such. Instead, it does subscribe to the American-inspired strategic definition of an Indo-Pacific region. In terms of fashioning New Zealand choices about China, this language actually deflects away from one important fact. Over the past 30 years, East Asian neighbors of China have, for the most part, privately but consistently counseled Washington against a policy of containment of China, so that comparing notes in Asian capitals remains indispensable for New Zealand as it ponders choice. As the 2021 chair of APEC, New Zealand will have the opportunity to refocus the narrative around Asia Pacific, which defines its priority interests more clearly. When assessing choices, obviously New Zealand must look to consistency. The charge sheet against China, disregard for international law and severe human rights violations also characterize a number of Middle Eastern governments that which enjoy US and others political, military, and diplomatic protection. It is a region where outside interests palpably trump outside values. Unacceptable Chinese actions undeniably warrant censure, but the drumbeat about China's threat reverberates now to such a degree that comes close to demonization of China as malevolent about everything. Within the US, evidence indicates that such vilification is spilling over into a wider anti-Asian scaremongering, something that we need to think seriously about here. International circumstances today are different, but overseas overtones of 20th century Cold War demonization are clearly evident. Historians now agree that the tensions then in the Cold War were driven by exaggerated rhetoric about capabilities and intent, so as to justify stupendous military budgets and forward deployments. Absolute US military superiority endures. The South China Sea is a source of special tension and involves two competing regional security claims. China retains an interest in the freedom of commercial navigation, given its vital reliance on seaboard trade, but opposes free military navigation in its maritime approaches, which is strongly asserted by the United States. The choice here for New Zealand diplomatic support is a delicate one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to open the floor to take some questions. Please wait for the microphones. We have two here. When you ask a question, please mention your name and affiliation and keep the question short. Thank you. Yes, please. Please wait for the microphone so that our speakers from overseas can hear as well. Thank you. And please don't forget we have Allan and Michael as well.
Thank you, Allan, Victoria University. A South Korean minister recently said asking a country to choose between China and the United States is like asking a child to choose between its mother and its father.
Well, let me take a very quick response. I agree with the South Korean minister's sentiments entirely. And as I suggested, I think we may be looking at a world where different country keeps different company with other countries on different issues. I think that's highly likely, although what that means for multilateral institutions like the UN, WTO, and indeed APEC, which you were involved with, Allan, it has yet to be seen. But I agree with his sentiment. I don't, when people insist that New Zealand is going to have to take choices, they mean one choice, which is, of course, to support the US position on China. And I'm not sure that we are able to do that, at least entirely.
Yeah. Is that working? I kind of agree too. I mean, there is, both countries offer something, but I also think that we're at a point where hopefully the child that in this situation is going to be New Zealand is grown up enough or mature enough that we can be making decisions based on what we believe in. And so sometimes you have to make hard decisions and tell mum or dad that you disagree with them, and maybe that will cause a rift, and hopefully down the track you can get back together for a family reunion. But I don't think that if we're using this analogy, you don't necessarily need to agree with your parents at all points. thankfully my parents aren't here. But hopefully that, I mean, I think Nanaia Mahuta has spoken about, you know, the maturing of our foreign policy. And I think that's probably a really important point right now.
Any views from Washington, DC or Canberra? Michael or Allan, would you like to add something?
I didn't actually hear the question. It was not very, it didn't come through very clearly. So I'm not sure what it is you're all reacting to.
Nor am I, Maty. It didn't make it across the Tasman.
So the question was from a South Korean minister who said that choosing between China and US would be like choosing between your father and mother. What do you think?
I don't think Australians would see it as choosing between your father and mother. I think. Look, foreign policy is about the management of complex differences between countries in the international system. There are issues on which we're going to agree with other countries. There are issues on which we are going to disagree. And the part of statecraft, which foreign policy represents, is the bit that you know, enables you to manage these these differences in a subtle way. So I don't see any difference really between New Zealand's policies on China and Australia. I think it's entirely possible for both of us to adhere to the criticisms we've made of the situation with the Uyghurs or in Hong Kong, and at the same time to deal with China on other issues. The world is a complicated place, and our job is to deal with those complications.
I agree with that very much. I agree with what Allan just said. I guess I would just say that countries need to be aware that not every country is equal in relationship to others. And in the international system, some countries are regarded as formal treaty allies, as we well know. And the United States has several of them in Asia and in Europe. And treaty allies have supposed responsibilities and duties in interacting with one another regarding security-related issues. This does create a certain type of constraint on some countries in how they deal with third parties. But I think what it means in our current situation, and given American policies towards China and China's policies towards the US allies in particular have a very difficult challenge. They need to be able to create a solid middle ground, if you will, with the United States on dealing with China, without, however, alienating their relationships with Beijing, which are so vitally important for almost every single one of them. And on this, as I often say to my friends in Australia and in South Korea and Japan and in Europe, these countries have a great, in my view, great degree of responsibility to speak up for their positions on China, and to try to push back against the more harsh zero-sum assessments that are routinely now being made in Washington about China. I think it doesn't behoove America's allies to simply lock onto a policy stance by the United States that is really seen as excessively confrontational regarding the Chinese. Now, that's not to say that these countries should not push back against and criticize Chinese behavior when it's quite clear that they are doing things in violation of their own agreements and their own laws in many cases, and they're threatening the interests of several countries. For sure, you should do that, and you need to have collective action to doing that, but it shouldn't be done in a way that accentuates the worst case assumptions and that makes it in every case almost zero sum. We're tending now in the United States to, the term now is to securitize. We're securitizing every issue involving China. If it's subway cars running in Washington, D.C., it's a national security threat. If it's Chinese sale of some kinds of toys somewhere, that's a national security threat. I mean, it's becoming blown out of all proportion. And I think other countries really can play a role in trying to rein the US in some regards on these sorts of issues.
Thank you. We can take other questions. Yes, please. Please check if the microphone is working.
Hi, thanks very much. Nick Snyder from the US Embassy. Actually, when Maty asked me to speak, I said I didn't think it would be appropriate because this is about the US, about Australia, New Zealand, and China, but turns out to be about the US. So, so I will just say very, very quickly, there was a lot to rebut here, a lot that I deeply disagree with as a representative of the United States government here. And I would say that we are actually working with our allies and partners very closely, not to contain China, not to securitize everything, and exposing all our warts, acknowledging all our problems of racial injustice and other things. But we're working very hard in the multilateral space to sort of bring a broader consensus, and we're working with our allies and partners because it's in their self-interest too. South China Sea, the decision by The Hague, ignored by China. The Rose Garden promise by Xi Jinping to not indulge in cyber hacking, to not militarize the South China Sea, ignored by China. And when I say China, I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party, not the people of China, with whom we enjoy billions of dollars of trade and very strong people-to-people and business linkages still. So please don't fall for this sort of false rhetoric about the relationship between the people of China and the people of the United States. So, of course, there's all the human rights problems in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So I ask our distinguished panel here how to respond to those sort of alternative and, you know, keeping an open mind. Are we not indulging in false choices and false equivalences here? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. We're just going to get to Nick's question first. Who would like to respond to that?
Well, we're not seeking to make the choice. I'm not going to speak for the New Zealand position on any of that. And I think the difference made, I think the historical point that Allan Gyngell made earlier about the position of well, Australia, China, up to say 2010, 2012 gives a fair indication of where Australia has been able to be. We were not making choices. We've been able to work with China. We've been able to trade with China, and we are very open at this time to a sensible, strong dialogue with China about many of the issues that are standing between us and the sort of economic relationship we had in the past. So I'm not going to comment on New Zealand and the choices it might seek to make, far from it. I just simply put the Australian position on some of this.
Thank you. Any comments from New Zealand part?
Well, I think that New Zealand's position as a small nation that operates, for the most part, beneath the radar screens of the big boys in the world. We previously used to think that that was a grand disadvantage. We were being marginalized and forgotten about. I'm sure that is still the case in many instances, but we've slowly begun to realize, and especially at this juncture, that flying beneath the radar screens of powerful nations and in the total absence of hard power is not a disadvantage, providing we play our cards correctly and nimbly and so on. As to the criticisms of the United States, I mean, they're partly driven by a feeling of disappointment that a country that has claimed so much and given so much to the world, and for which we earn a gratitude, are falling so short of the ideals that they espoused in the past and they assert that they're espousing now. So there's a point of divergence and a point too of even-handedness. Let's say, for example, China is not observing international law and breaking rules where it sees fit. Well, China is far from the only major power which behaves in such a way. And for example, give you an example, China is accused of finding loopholes in the World Trade Organization rules and regulations and exploiting these to its advantage and disadvantage of others. Well, that may well be true but I hasten to, I have to remember that for 50 years, the United States granted itself a waiver from applying all GATT trade rules to agriculture. It just stood outside the whole system, exploiting, therefore, a rather large gap. And I feel sure that China is exploiting gaps, but it's this disposition to, I don't know, to find others culpable of misdemeanors, which your own country is also committing, which is a difficult point, and for a desire to be even-handed. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, in the front. I just want to make sure, do our speakers from overseas hear the questions? Can you hear the questions?
Yes, I can hear you.
This question is primarily directed to Allan and Terence, both of whom were policymakers during the Cold War era, and it stems partly from that. I know, because I've been told directly by people who are currently in high official positions in the US, I won't name them, that they believe that there is in fact a second Cold War, and that the United States will win it. And they're basing that on the fact, of course, they won the first Cold War. So I wonder, A, is that in fact a precedent that is of any value whatsoever? And B, what would winning look like anyway?
Thank you. Shall we start with Allan, please?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Terence. Look, I don't think we are, whatever we're heading into, I don't think it's going to be a second Cold War in the way that the first one was. The obvious difference is that China is far more integrated, far more into the global economy, far more important to a wider range of countries than the Soviet Union ever was, and that makes any attempts to draw parallels between the inevitable victory, the inevitable only in retrospect, I hasten to say, of the United States during the Cold War and what's happening with China now, I think pretty meaningless. One thing though that I think we are seeing, and I think it's a concern, is an increasing tendency to sort of to cut off economic avenues, particularly in the area of high tech. So I think what we're heading into is something which is going to look different from the first Cold War, but also different from the world we've been used to over the last 30 30 years or so, more countries are going to have to make choices about whether they go along with with China on issues like 5G or with the United States and its allies. I think the outcome is much less certain, but as I said during my presentation, I actually do believe in the things that we say about liberal democracies and their ability to change and respond to new circumstances more easily. So I still have confidence in what's going to come from it, but I don't think it's going to be like the Cold War, except, as I was saying, that anything which makes conflict between great powers more likely is extremely dangerous. And I don't think we've yet got our minds around what the consequences of serious conflict between China and the United States would be.
I agree entirely with what Allan has said. My point in raising the Cold War in my presentation was to admit that the circumstances today are greatly different, as Allan suggests, but the rhetoric is starting on, at least in public, of amounting to demonization of China in particular, which I believe is dangerous. But I agree entirely with Allan that the actual situation, especially in the economic area, is quite different from the last time.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back, please. Yes. Please.
Yeah, I'm Kevin Zing. I'm a Wellington-based Chinese local newspaper, Home Voice. I just want to ask Nikkhou about you worry about China, about the democracy. I just want you to history. Come back 50 years ago, 40 years ago, before the Cultural Revolution. In China is very, very tough and by the chairman Mao Zedong. But after Deng Xiaoping take over power, China, the Communist Party will be got right wing and the left wing. What means some people support capitalist, some people support socialist. So you can see the history. Another the head is Zhao Ziyang and Wen Jiabao. That's all we can judge he's a capitalist. And Xi Jinping and Jiang Zemin, we can judge he's a socialist. So there's a democracy under China inside the Communist Party is already much improved, and not only the 40 years ago or like Soviet Union this year. So this means we need to put on us to see the history. How do you comment? China democracy is already improved much, and the whole world see that. They're already peaceful to change more than 4 times hit the president from Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, and now it's Xi Jinping. But we can't say we can't make a judgment. Xi Jinping will be like.
Sorry, what is your question?
What's question is how do you comment that China's democracy improve?
Well, is that addressed at me? I think it's addressed at me. He mentioned me.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
I don't think there's any question that in many respects, China has improved its situation enormously since the Mao Zedong period. I mean, this is something that many people are not either aware of or they just ignore when they look at China today, because they focus on the Chinese Communist Party and what it's doing, and they think that that defines China across the board throughout its society. In fact, you've had a China under the leadership of the Communist Party over a period of decades that has made enormous strides in bettering the life of most of the average Chinese people, in exposing them to outside influences, and with them traveling overseas, they become more sophisticated in the urban elites, at least. They become more affluent. And as a result of this, to a great extent, they become more proud of their country. And they become proud even of the regime in various ways, while at the same time frustrated by its repression. And that's the problem, is that you have a regime that has achieved enormous things, but it's been done on the basis of a very largely top-down structure of power and rule that's centralized, and with a certain level of autonomy and initiative to lower levels. But nonetheless, it has certainly not allowed for the level of political freedom of speech and individual freedoms in terms of political behavior that you would expect from a more developed country. And that's really the problem. And under Xi Jinping, in some respects, China seems to be going back in the opposite direction again. It is placing less of an emphasis on the role of institutions writ large, less of an emphasis on the role of the government in China as opposed to the party, much greater emphasis on the function of ideology as a way of guiding behavior, even within private enterprises within China. And of course, it has again extolled the idea of the individual leader and his personality and his thought as being the core meaning of the leadership, and away from the idea of a collective leadership and a leadership that debates issues in a more open way, which you arguably had in previous Chinese leaders after Deng Xiaoping. So there are some real troubling developments in China today politically. And I certainly would not say China is a democratic country today, or more democratic than it was in the past in some important respects. It certainly allows for greater freedoms in some areas, but on the political side, it is still very much a repressive and ideological country domestically.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, please. And then we stop. This gentleman, please, in the middle.
Thank you very much. Question for Lucy. Just on values-based foreign policy, good points you made there. Is this applied selectively or universally? Because obviously in the last 2 decades, in the Middle East specifically, there have been many human rights violations, and sometimes in places like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and most recently in Gaza, 66 children were killed. Do you think this can apply universally, or are we selecting countries that we apply, I mean, especially in the media discourse that we see out there? Thank you.
Am I on? I think, I mean, in an ideal world, we would, I think in the ideal world, we would be able to have all foreign policy based on values based. I mean, we shouldn't be prioritizing discussion about what's happening in China over the death of children in Gaza. I mean, you know, a death is a death wherever it is, and we should be discussing it. I suppose as far as media discourse goes, there's only so many column inches in a newspaper, and unfortunately, there is only so much people will read as well. I mean, when you cover situations, working for an American paper and covering situations that were often breaking or really bad, you realize that, you know, you've got someone's attention for a short space of time. And I think that challenges how you can tell a story and how often you can tell a story. And unfortunately, it also kind of changes where you maybe are telling stories or what stories you are telling. I mean, I think there are places that it's easier to censure. I mean, it was quite easy to tweet following the riots in the Capitol buildings in the US about concerns about what was going on there. And at the same time, there were pro-democracy people being arrested in Hong Kong, and it was much more difficult to tweet about that. You know, one, you can tweet off the cuff. The other, you probably have to go through a number of rounds of people at MFAT before you're allowed to send anything, which I think probably brings it back to, I mean, there are choices to be made, and I don't really have an answer. I mean, as I said, I would like foreign values-based foreign policy to be how everything is done, but unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world.
Thank you. Now we're going to close this discussion, but this is an ongoing discussion and I hope we will continue further. A big thank you to Honorable Simon Bridges for hosting us, and a huge thanks to all of speakers from here and overseas. Please join me thanking them. Kia kite ana.
Based on how we feel. But I think that point about it's a good start. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to have you.
Oh, good.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you.
You can wait.